Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Bari, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about autism in my early childhood. So, before I begin, I just want to say there could be some potential trigger warnings, mainly in relation to the topics of emotional and verbal abuse, as well as gaslighting. If you are uncomfortable with these particular topics, then it would be best for you to skip these parts. I will let you guys know when these parts will come up, and of course, this is so this podcast is safe for you to listen to. So, going back to my childhood is something that can be really difficult at times, especially because there are some traumatic incidents in my childhood that I don't really like to revisit. Now, being an autistic person, my childhood wasn't exactly worse than what people would expect. But at the same time, it wasn't exactly perfect either. There were instances where I had difficulties growing up, mainly because of autism, since there were so many things that I felt like were wrong with me. I guess, in a sense, from early childhood, whilst I didn't know what autism was, I felt that I didn't really belong. So, in a sense, being an autistic child was kind of the equivalent of being an alien. You're used to your home planet and all its amenities, and then all of a sudden you get dropped off into Earth. So, you have to learn human mannerisms and do exactly as humans would do. So, in other words, you find yourself having to conform so that nobody would pick up on the fact that you're completely different to everyone else. So, in terms of autism in itself, according to dictionary.com, it is described as a neurodevelopmental condition of variable severity with lifelong effects that can be recognized from early childhood, chiefly characterized by difficulties with social interaction and communication, as well as restricted or repetitive patterns of thought and behavior. So, the thing with autism is that it is a spectrum, so no autistic person is ever the same. There are typically three different levels of autism. So, level one is for an autistic person that requires the least amount of support in their everyday life. Level 2 is for an autistic person that may require substantial support whilst having similar characteristics to somebody in level 1, but to a greater extent. And then level 3 is for an autistic person that does require the most support in their everyday life. Now, I would be classed as an autistic person on the level 1 side of the spectrum, or as most people would say, quote unquote, high functioning. Now, in terms of quote unquote high functioning autistics, typically they are presented as neurotypical people. So they look neurotypical, but then they have traits that neurotypical people might not often have. So, this could primarily include trouble in terms of understanding social conventions, a disinterest social interaction, as well as emotional or sensory dysregulation. And certain restricted interests and repetitive traits include a need for additional personal organization strategies, behavioral rigidity and inflexibility, stress during transitions, attention span differences, and the habit of focusing on something longer than is helpful. So, from personal experience, mainly in my teens, although I will get to that in another episode, whenever I used to mention that I was autistic, I always used to get comments saying that I don't look autistic. And I guess this is because I was just a person who appeared to be neurotypical and was, I guess, as some people might think, conventionally attractive. I have a fairly independent lifestyle. So, as an adult, obviously, I do have a full time job. I'm capable of doing basic tasks like cooking, cleaning, and managing my money okay. I also have good hygiene, and I guess I am independent enough in the sense that I can mostly support myself. Now, as a child, there were instances where I required a bit of extra support in my life. So, growing up as a child, I was first diagnosed with autism when I was 2 years old. So, this was first identified in 2001 as I mainly had issues with delayed speech and had multiple needs, especially in the relation to social interaction and understanding of phrases, as well as health and safety and cause and effect. Now, because of my delayed speech, I wasn't able to actually speak properly until I was about 5 years old. During early years of primary school, I was often taken out of classes primarily because of my delayed speech. So I would often have to learn how to communicate, learn other things like hand eye coordination. And it was mostly my mum that would take me to these sessions. So, from what I remember, she would either take days off work or do like half days and then take me to these classes and things like that. And even in primary school as well, I did receive a level of one to one support. So in certain classes, I often had assistant teachers helping me with my work and helping me try to sort of understand certain things that were going on in school so that I was okay with everything that was happening. Now, the things that I do remember in terms of being a child is that I was really quiet. Even now, I'm still what I would be considered to be like an introverted person. So, in my childhood, I was a really, really quiet person. I did have friends, but I often had issues understanding social cues. So if someone was joking with me, I wouldn't really understand if they were joking with me, or so, like, if I don't know, someone was saying my hair looked like a bird's nest or something, I would probably just cry and get really upset, because I was a very sensitive child, so I cried a lot. Even now, I still get very emotional very often. And I guess, in a sense, growing up, I've learned to sort of mask emotions, especially because I don't want people to see the vulnerable side of me. And of course, when I get to talking about autism in secondary school, I am going to provide more of a detailed explanation as to why I have started to mask my emotions up until now as an adult who is just in the cusp of their mid 20s. So, when it came to socializing, I wasn't really good at it, like, aside from not understanding jokes, I had a very hard time making friends because I was a very socially awkward person. Now, the thing when it comes to making friends is that I have a very hard time not only making friends, but keeping friends because I don't like to trust people. I have had multiple instances growing up where people have only befriended me out of convenience because they wanted something from me, or I would be let down by friends and I can never really trust them the same way again. And over time, I have developed really bad trust issues, which I still have now because I'm used to being let down by people, not just friends, but even my own family as well, which I will get into in more detail, most likely in a future episode. Now, despite these particular issues, I actually did have a close friend in primary school who, like myself, is autistic and level one on the spectrum, if that makes sense. So, we would often hang out during breaks and we would sit next to each other in classes. And we would also go to each other's houses sometimes to hang out and even call each other after school. And, our parents had a really good friendship with each other, although over time, I haven't really spoken to my close friend in years, primarily because our lives have sort of changed. So I believe nowadays they're working just like myself, and they also attended university just like myself. But every now and then we still text each other, and I would like to meet with them at some point just to catch up because it's been quite a long time. But I did have a close friend, and it was good having a close friend because I wasn't alone and I didn't feel so lonely all the time. And when you have that one close friend that you can trust, I feel it's a really good thing because you have somebody that you can talk to, especially when you're feeling down. And I think that's kind of what I needed as a child, was like quality people who I know I could be myself around, people who are going to be accepting of me, and people who weren't going to put me down. Because even as a child, I used to be put down a lot, especially by family. And, you know, even now, when I look back at those memories, I do get really upset. I mean, as I'm recording this, I'm crying right now because of certain things I've experienced in my childhood. So, to continue, when it came to my classes, I wouldn't really say that I was falling behind. I mean, I actually remember doing pretty well with most of my classes. And when I was in year six, I remember leaving school with pretty reasonable grades. So I think I left with mostly level four or five grades, particularly in English, mathematics, and science. So when it came to certain topics, especially with maths, there were things that I could somewhat pick up very quickly, but then there were things I wasn't really good at. I mean, I didn't really like physical education, I wasn't really good at it. But it's a bit of a strange thing because I used to do gymnastics as an extracurricular, although I think from what I remember in my primary school years, I did do quite a few extracurriculars. So I used to do choir as well, and I used to do swimming, but then I quit because when I did choir, I used to cry a lot during sad songs, and then I just lost my interest in it. So I had a habit of losing interest in certain things pretty often. So I quit choir just because I didn't feel like doing it anymore. I quit gymnastics because I didn't want to do it anymore. And then I quit swimming because I had a very traumatizing experience where my swim coach was yelling at me and I started crying. And I remember my mum was on the other side just watching me do my swimming lessons, and I was just trying to tell her that I wanted to go home. So from there, I just didn't really want to do it anymore. And when it came to like my interests and things, I often was interested in reading, writing, and art. So I remember, especially if it was raining, I used to draw a lot. And I started getting interested in art at a very early age and always wanted to be an artist. And even now, I have not lost my interest in the creative industry. So I still want to hopefully become a self employed artist, although I'm not really sure if that's going to happen. But it's just something I still love doing. And I remember having an interest in fairies as well. So there was this one particular doll that I really liked when I was a little girl called Felicity Wishes. So my mum bought her for me from a local shop, and she came with this really cute baker's costume. And I remember being obsessed with collecting the magazines when I was a kid. So I'd get my mum to buy as many magazines for me because Felicity would have different clothes that would correspond to each job that she would do. So I always used to like to dress her up in different clothes, and I always used to pretend that she was real. So, in a sense, she was kind of like a best friend to me who would talk to me and help me with my problems. And the only thing though was when it came to my interest in fairies, I used to get bullied mainly for that. So in primary school, I was often the subject of bullying, and it was really horrible, you know. I always used to cry so much, and I guess I kind of wish I was a little bit stronger, but I was a very sensitive child, and I guess being autistic as well, that didn't really help because being sensitive was kind of seen as a flaw. Now, when it came to certain traits, there were certain things I really hated in my childhood. So, for example, when it came to routines, I liked knowing what to expect each day. So, when I used to go to school, I would have a consistent timetable with classes, and I knew exactly what was coming up. And even now, as an adult, having a consistent routine is one of the things that keeps me sane. So, if there was any last minute surprises or last minute changes, it would sort of throw me off, and I would just not know how to handle that, if that makes sense. But there were certain sensory issues I also had as well. So, like, I remember I always used to hate loud noises. It was so traumatizing for me because whenever I heard loud noises as a kid, I would cry and I would have to cover my ears. And one particular noise I hated is like the popping noises. So if a balloon was popping, that would make me really upset because it was so sudden. And I also hated Aero chocolate. So I remember trying Aero chocolate once as a kid, and I didn't like the popping noise in my ears, and I cried because the noise was just giving me a headache, and it was like a sensory overload. And when it came to other like sensory issues, I also had texture aversion with food. So I'm not going to say I had a bad relationship with food, but I often had a questionable relationship with food. So I was a very picky eater. So, like, when it came to food, there were certain things I just didn't like, and I had certain comfort foods that would make me feel happy. So, when it came to food in general, I was very picky with what I ate. I didn't like certain foods touching each other, and I also really hated certain textures. So, baked beans is an example of food I really hated as a child and still do now as an adult. So, I remember eating, I think it was fish and chips, and I used to eat around the baked beans if they served it because I didn't like anything relating to baked beans whatsoever. I didn't like the beans, I didn't like the sauce, I didn't like it touching the rest of my food, so I would just kind of eat around it. And if there was any bit of food that had baked beans on it, for example, I would not touch it because it would make me feel sick. And I remember one of the teachers telling me that I had to eat all my food. So I tried a spoonful of baked beans and I felt sick, and the slimy texture did not sit well with my tongue, and I could feel it sort of back up from my throat, and it was just not a pleasant experience. And since that particular day, I just don't touch baked beans in general. I also didn't like certain food smells. So with condiments, I hated the smell of ketchup. So I remember when I used to get burgers, like the hamburgers, they would have to be plain ones because if it had ketchup in it and I tasted it, I would cry because I hated the smell and I hated the sweetness of it, and it just made me feel sick. The same thing applied to mayonnaise, and mayonnaise is a bit of a strange one because the only forms of mayonnaise I can actually eat without being sick are tartar sauce, although that has to be in fish and chips only, or black pepper mayo in the KFC mini fillet burgers because they do have this nice black pepper mayo, which I would highly recommend. Or if I'm eating eggs slash tuna or salmon mayonnaise sandwiches, that's okay because I know it's not making me feel sick. But anything else with any other type of mayonnaise, I will not eat it because I would feel ill. I also had a habit of going off certain foods really quickly. So the thing with food is I was very funny with what I ate. So, for example, as a kid, I used to love eating white bread, and then one day I just went off it. So, if I was in school and I wanted to eat cheese sandwiches, which were actually my favorite type of sandwich back then, I remember the cooks would save brown bread sandwiches because I went off white bread completely. And if I ate even a small bit of white bread, I would just cry because the texture and the taste was just disgusting to me. And I also went off other types of food. So I went off eggs really quickly. I hated runny yolks. So if my dad would cook eggs for me, they had to be hard boiled. If it was soft boiled or fried, the yolk running, I wouldn't eat it at all. I didn't like bananas because of the slimy texture. But nowadays I do eat bananas and I actually like the texture of them. And I do eat eggs a lot. And I use eggs very often when I'm doing fried rice, which is really strange because as a kid I hated eggs. And then I tried them again and I actually like them now. I also used to eat Heinz chocolate puddings, so that was kind of one of my favorite comfort foods. So my mum would get these puddings for me that would come in the tin, and you had the pudding itself and the chocolate sauce. But then one day I kind of went off those and just stopped eating it completely because the smell just made me feel sick. The same thing applied to custard. I used to like it, and then I just went off it because the smell just started making me feel sick. I went off salami as well because the smell made me feel sick. But nowadays, I do use it in pizza sometimes, and I'm okay with eating it now. But I really was very funny with the foods I would go off and things like that, and even meat as well. I was very funny with meat as a kid. I didn't like anything other than chicken and fish. Beef and pork were exceptions, but I can only eat them in mince form, and even now as an adult, it's the same thing. If someone cooked me like a beef steak or a pork chop or something, I wouldn't eat it, but if it was in mince, then it's okay. Now, when it came to food, one thing I didn't like was how people would sort of criticize me for not eating certain things. So, if I went to family functions, mainly my dad's family would criticize me for not eating certain things they cooked. So, I would always be told I was rude if I didn't want to try something, but then everybody else, especially my older cousins, they could do whatever they wanted. So, like, if my grandma cooked fritters, they would be oily and very disgusting, and all you could taste was like oil or something. And my dad would used to tell me to say they were nice to avoid hurting her feelings, but I really wanted to say that I didn't like it because the grease was too much and it made me feel sick. But I couldn't really say that because then if I expressed my real views to my dad's family, it was a problem as they encouraged you to conform to their ideals. I also used to be made fun of by my dad's family for crying. So the thing with them was that they never really supported me. They never really understood what I needed. And by the way, this is kind of the part where I'm getting to little bits of detail about emotional abuse and gaslighting, as well as verbal abuse. So, again, I would suggest you skip this part if it makes you uncomfortable. So, back to what I was saying before. My dad's family used to make fun of me a lot for crying, and I was even made fun of for watching one of my favourite comfort shows as a kid. So I was like 7, and I used to watch Tweeny's VHS tapes, and my older cousins would like make fun of me for that, saying I was like a baby or something when I was still a kid, and it's like, you know, even when I was a kid and I used to bring like my Felicity Wishes doll, sometimes they would put it in like a toy car or something, and I didn't want them to touch her. Because the thing is, as well, is like I was very territorial over my personal space and belongings. Like, I hated people touching my stuff. I still do now. So, if someone rearranges something in my room, for example, it just throws me off. Although nowadays I just get really angry very easily. And, I hated people touching my things. I didn't like people getting into my personal space, like my family hugging me, for example. I didn't like it. I just wanted them to sort of get off me and not touch me because when people touch me, I just feel really sick inside, if that makes sense. But when it came to food, as I was saying before, my dad's family always used to make fun of me for not eating certain food items. So the way things would work with them was that it was one rule for me and it was another for everybody else. So people could do whatever they wanted, and I had to conform to fit their ideals. And I remember when my autistic traits sort of came into play, my family would, well, mainly my dad's side, would get really mad at me. I remember certain events, like, for example, when I accidentally broke a picture frame, which I didn't mean to do, and they just started screaming at me, and I didn't want to be dropped off there. And then there were instances where I used to cry a lot. I was told by them I was stupid and ungrateful, and they would just make me feel very insignificant. And as a child, it's really sad knowing that you're going to your grandparents' house and you kind of have to hear these things being said to you. Like when you go to your grandparents' house, you're supposed to feel warm. You're supposed to feel like, I don't know how to explain it, but you're supposed to have this comforting feeling like someone is hugging you and is going to give you cookies or something. You're not supposed to be walking on eggshells, but then again, that was something I had to deal with quite often, and this is going to be talked about in another episode that I'm planning in the future. But yeah, I used to walk around on eggshells quite a lot as a child around certain people because I didn't know who was going to be mad at me. I didn't know who was going to be yelling at me next. And as a child, it's really sad that you have to kind of sit there and listen to people do these things to you. It's just really sad. But anyway, I think this is pretty much the autism in childhood episode. So there was a lot more that I wish I could cover, but I really will be talking more about certain things in future episodes. But this is pretty much all I could remember because my childhood was years ago, and I'm 25 years old now, so I'm not really going to remember everything, but there are certain things that I will remember. So, the next episode that I plan to do is going to be about autism in secondary school, which will be broken down into three parts because I have so much to unpack, especially as I am going to be talking about sensitive topics like self harm and suicide, because unfortunately I did go through those things, and this is where my diagnosis for clinical depression comes in because I did first have it when I was around 13 or 14, from what I remember, and I still suffer with it today. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me rambling on about autism in my childhood, at least trying to recall what I could remember. But as per mentioned, when it comes to my podcasts, I don't really follow a script. So this is just me talking from my heart and talking to you guys like a friend as I sit down in my bed, mostly with a glass of wine, as I am speaking into a microphone. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to today's episode, and I hope that you have an amazing day. Of course, I am going to mention in the description when the next episode is going to be released, which will be next week, Sunday. So until then, I hope you all enjoy your day. Bye!